After 20 years of marriage, I caught her with the gym trainer. The next morning, I canceled her credit cards, froze the accounts, and filed for divorce. When I look back at my life before everything broke apart, it feels like a play where I didn't notice half the actors were reading from a different script. For 20 years, I believed I had built something steady with my wife, Irina. We met when we were young, married quickly, and somehow lasted through the years when friends divorced left and right. I thought we were one of the few who had managed to pass all the storms. The rhythm of our life had become predictable, almost mechanical. I worked long hours in logistics, building up a career that kept us comfortable. She stayed involved in smaller ventures, book clubs, charity groups, and more recently, her obsessive dedication to fitness. Our daughter, Yulia, had grown into her own adult life, away at university, but often visiting. On weekends, we cooked together or traveled to the countryside. If anyone had asked me what my marriage was like, I would have said it was solid. Not perfect, but real. What I missed, or rather what I refused to acknowledge, were the cracks forming in the surface. They weren't loud or obvious. They were subtle changes. Irina spending more and more time at the gym, her phone clutched like an extension of her arm, the sudden secrecy about her social life. At first, I brushed it off as midlife restlessness. Everyone at some point looks for something new when the years become heavy. But then came the late nights. She used to be home by 8 at the latest, tired from her training sessions. Then it became 9, then 10, sometimes later. Her explanation was always the same: extra classes, new group programs, or a friend's late workout session. I wanted to believe her because the alternative was something I didn't want to even imagine. When you've spent 2 decades with someone, suspicion feels like betrayal in itself. So, I kept quiet. There were other signs too. Expensive gym clothes appearing in the closet, things she never asked me about but bought herself. Payments for memberships and special sessions that seemed unusually costly. I had access to our joint statements, but for years I trusted her with handling household spending. That trust became a blindfold. One evening, everything finally tilted. It was a Thursday, and I had been stuck late at work going through shipping reports that refused to balance. Around 10, I decided I'd had enough, closed my laptop, and drove home earlier than usual for a late night. I remember the streets were empty, lit by the yellow glow of lamps, the kind of quiet that feels like the city itself has fallen asleep. Halfway home, I passed near the gym where Irina trained. Normally, I wouldn't have paid attention. But that night, I noticed her car in the parking lot. At first, I thought nothing of it. Maybe she had stayed for a long workout. Yet something inside me, something sharp and insistent, told me to pull over. The gym was closed. The front doors were locked, the lights off. Only the parking lot had a few cars. I sat in my own car for a moment, convincing myself I was imagining things. Then I saw movement near the side of the building. A door opened. Not the main entrance, but a service door by the back. Irina walked out. She wasn't alone. The man with her was tall, muscular, the type who lived in the gym rather than just visited it. I recognized him vaguely. Pavel, one of the trainers she had spoken about. I never liked the way she mentioned him. Too casual, too frequent. They weren't simply leaving the gym together. They were too close, bodies leaning into each other in a way that spoke of familiarity beyond casual friendship. At one point, he reached for her waist, and she didn't resist. I sat there, hidden by the darkness, watching what looked like a scene torn from someone else's life. It's difficult to describe the sensation in that moment. It wasn't a sharp pain like I'd expected. It was a dull heaviness, like a stone had been placed on my chest, one that grew heavier the longer I watched. I didn't storm out of the car, didn't scream or confront them. I stayed quiet, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they hurt. They walked to her car, laughing about something, oblivious to the fact that I was only meters away. When Irina finally drove off with him in his own car following behind, I let her go. The engine of my car hummed softly as I sat motionless. My marriage, 20 years of building a life together, had just shifted into something unrecognizable. I drove home slowly, my thoughts twisting in directions I hadn't expected. It wasn't just betrayal. It was the sheer audacity of it, the way she had moved through our life as if everything were normal, as if 20 years meant nothing. And still, when I opened the front door to our house, the smell of her perfume lingered. The lights were dimmed exactly how she liked them. On the surface, nothing had changed. She arrived home nearly an hour later. By then, I was in bed, pretending to be asleep. She moved quietly, slipping under the covers beside me. My body felt stiff, my breathing forced, but I didn't let her see anything. There was no confrontation, no explosion of anger. Instead, I lay in silence, my mind already planning the next steps. It wasn't a matter of if I would act, but how. Confrontation would give her excuses, tears, manipulations. I knew her well enough to predict that. She would twist the story, paint herself as misunderstood, claim loneliness or confusion. If I wanted to truly protect myself, I needed precision, not rage. The night stretched on with her asleep at my side, unaware that I had already made my decision. By morning, our marriage would no longer exist in the way she thought it did, and she would not see it coming. The strange part was that I felt calm, not peaceful, but steady, like someone who had just stepped into cold water and accepted the shock. I knew the betrayal was real. I had seen it with my own eyes. I didn't need explanations or confessions. I needed action. When dawn finally came, lights spilling through the curtains, Irina stirred beside me and greeted me like nothing had happened. She spoke casually about her day, about errands she had planned, about groceries. I nodded, gave small replies, all the while making mental calculations. That day would be the turning point. I knew her routine, her dependence on the financial comfort I had always provided. Every card in her wallet, every account she accessed, all of it traced back to me. I had given her trust, and she had converted it into betrayal. Now, I would take it back. She left in the morning, cheerful and distracted, still convinced that her double life was invisible. I stayed behind, sipping coffee at the kitchen table, the documents of our finances open in front of me. The path was clear. What I didn't realize at the time was that the betrayal was more complex than a single affair. What I had seen that night in the parking lot was only the beginning. The depth of what she had done, how she had entangled me in lies beyond just her body, would reveal itself soon enough. But in that first moment, as the house grew quiet and I prepared to make my first moves, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The life I thought I had was gone, and a new one was about to begin. The morning after that sleepless night, I walked into my office earlier than usual. Not to bury myself in work, but to set things in motion. My company had always given me privileges at the bank because of the contracts I managed. That morning, I used those privileges for something more personal. I started by freezing every account Irina had access to. Our joint accounts, her cards, the secondary credit line I had foolishly opened for her years ago, all suspended. The banker didn't ask many questions. He knew me, trusted me, and when I told him I suspected fraud, he only nodded. Within 30 minutes, Irina's financial lifeline was cut. Next, I called a lawyer I had once helped with a business deal. He owed me a favor. We arranged an emergency consultation for later that day. When I hung up, I felt a cold steadiness take hold of me. It wasn't joy, but it was satisfaction. Irina had no idea yet. She was out shopping, as she often did after her morning workout. Around noon, my phone buzzed with a message. She couldn't pay for her purchases. A few minutes later, another message followed, this one sharp, demanding to know what had happened. I ignored it. By the time I returned home that evening, she was waiting, her anger boiling. She paced the kitchen, holding one of her useless cards, demanding explanations. I didn't bother with arguments. I told her, plainly, that the accounts were frozen, that a divorce lawyer had been contacted, and that her life as she knew it was finished. Her face changed in that instant, shock, disbelief, then fury. But as I turned to leave, her fury shifted to something else. Panic. She followed me, asking questions she hadn't asked in years, questions about paperwork, about old loans, about documents she thought I'd forgotten. And that was when the real weight of her betrayal began to show. I spent the next few days pulling at threads. At first, I thought it was just an affair. But what I uncovered was far more dangerous. Irina had been taking loans under both of our names, small at first, then larger, always tucked into the background of our finances. She had forged my signature more than once. Some of the debts were already overdue, hidden beneath the surface, waiting to explode. It wasn't only betrayal of marriage, it was betrayal of trust at the most fundamental level. If I had not acted, I would have woken up one day to find myself drowning in debts I had never agreed to. My lawyer confirmed it. She could be held accountable, but proving the forgery would take effort. He asked me to gather documents, statements, anything that could show the timeline. The thought of walking into a courtroom with 20 years of shared life reduced to evidence and signatures made me sick, but there was no other path. While I prepared, Irina tried new tactics. First came the anger, accusations that I was cruel, that I was abandoning her after everything she had given me. Then came the tears, the rehearsed speeches about loneliness, about wanting to feel alive again. Finally, when none of that worked, she turned to threats. She spoke about taking the house, about ruining my reputation, about dragging me through court until I had nothing left. She underestimated me. I told her nothing about what I had discovered. Instead, I let her think the financial freeze was just revenge for the affair. She had no idea that I was building a case, quietly pulling together a record of every forged signature, every loan, every misused account. One evening, while going through a stack of bank letters, I found something that stopped me cold. A recent loan, far larger than the others, taken just months ago. The beneficiary wasn't Irina alone. It was listed under a joint signature, mine and hers. But the signature next to hers was not mine. It was a forgery, sloppily done, but still dangerous. The money from that loan had gone directly into an account I didn't recognize. After some digging, I traced it back. It wasn't her personal account. It belonged to Pavel, the gym trainer. That discovery changed everything. It wasn't just an affair of the body. It was financial collusion. She had funneled my money into another man's account. Suddenly, her long nights, her obsession with the gym, all of it connected in a web of lies. I sat there staring at the paper, realizing that my wife of 20 years had essentially been funding her lover's lifestyle with money tied to my name. And if I hadn't acted, I would have been the one buried under the weight of her recklessness. The next day, I met again with my lawyer, presenting the documents. His expression grew darker with each page. He told me plainly, this wasn't just grounds for divorce. It bordered on criminal fraud. If I wanted, I could push for prosecution. For the first time since discovering her betrayal, I felt something close to power. Not joy, but control. Irina, meanwhile, was unraveling. She still didn't know how much I had uncovered. She tried to keep appearances in front of Yulia, who had come home for a weekend visit. She played the doting mother, cooking, pretending everything was normal. But Yulia wasn't blind. She noticed the tension, the silences, the way her mother's voice trembled whenever money came up. Late that night, Yulia asked me quietly what was happening. I didn't tell her everything, but I told her enough. Her reaction was immediate. She admitted she had long suspected her mother's loyalty, though she never had proof. She remembered the times Irina had manipulated her with guilt, the way she had spoken about me when she thought Yulia wasn't listening. That conversation was both painful and strangely comforting. My daughter wasn't fooled. She saw through the facade. And when the time came, I knew she would stand by me. Still, the storm had only begun. Irina had built her lies carefully, and I was only starting to see the full picture. The financial trail was long, the betrayal deeper than I had imagined. Each discovery brought me closer to a truth that was far more corrosive than a simple affair. And as I prepared for the next phase, gathering more evidence, tightening the legal net, I realized something that chilled me. Pavel wasn't just a distraction in her life. He was a partner in her schemes. And if that was true, then I wasn't fighting just my wife. I was fighting a pair who had planned this carefully, hoping to drain me dry before I caught on. That realization hardened my resolve. This wouldn't be settled with tears, apologies, or even a quiet divorce. This was war, and I intended to win it. By the time a week had passed since I froze the accounts, the calm surface of my house had turned into a battlefield disguised as normal life. Irina moved through the rooms like a trapped animal, snapping at small things, avoiding my eyes, yet pretending in front of neighbors that nothing had changed. She underestimated how quickly lies rot when air and light hit them. The lawyer guided me through the next steps, insisting that the case had to be airtight. He wanted witnesses, supporting evidence, documents beyond suspicion. Alone, that might have been difficult, but betrayal has a way of calling other truths to the surface. One evening, as I was leaving for a meeting, my neighbor Sergei stopped me at the gate. He was older than me, retired, the kind of man who noticed everything while pretending to mind his own business. That night, he didn't pretend. He told me he had seen Irina more than once with Pavel, not only in the parking lot of the gym, but outside restaurants, cafes, even once at a hotel on the other side of the city. He hadn't said anything earlier because he didn't want to interfere, but now, with the divorce and rumors surfacing, he felt I deserved to know. I thanked him, though what I felt was a strange mix of relief and anger. Relief that my suspicions had been real, anger that people had known before me. Still, his words gave me a witness, someone who could confirm what I already had proof of. Meanwhile, Yulia became an unexpected ally. At first, she kept her distance, not wanting to be pulled into her parents' war. But Irina, blinded by desperation, tried to use her as a pawn. She whispered to her about how I was abandoning her, how I had grown cold and cruel. Yulia didn't buy it. She had grown up under Irina's sharp tongue, and while she still loved her, she wasn't blind to her manipulations. One night, after another tense dinner, Yulia stayed behind in the kitchen while Irina stormed off. She told me she had overheard a phone call days before, her mother hissing into the receiver about money problems and keeping him quiet. Yulia hadn't caught the full details, but it was enough to confirm that the affair and the finances were deeply entangled. The next step was obtaining hard proof. I worked with the lawyer to request statements from the gym and subpoena records of payments. The documents showed an unusual number of private sessions charged to our accounts, far beyond what normal training would require. Combined with the bank transfers to Pavel's account, The picture became clearer. Irina wasn't just a client. She had been funneling money to him under the guise of training. The lawyer smiled grimly when he saw it. Judges don't like seeing affairs mixed with financial fraud. She's digging her own grave. Still, Irina wasn't giving up easily. She tried to regain control, dressing up her betrayal in speeches about love and midlife crisis. She begged Yulia to side with her, cried in front of her friends about being betrayed by me, tried to paint herself as the victim. For a short while, she even managed to convince a few people in our circle that I was the one at fault. But truth has a way of sharpening its claws. The biggest blow came not from me, but from Pavel himself. Irina must have thought he would stand with her, that their affair meant loyalty. What she didn't realize was that Pavel's loyalty was to money, not to her. When he received the subpoena, his facade cracked. He panicked. His lawyer contacted mine, hinting that he would cooperate if it meant avoiding charges. That's when we discovered the full extent of his games. Pavel hadn't just been involved with Irina. He had been doing the same with at least 3 other women from the gym. Promises, secret meetings, financial manipulations, all carefully layered. To him, they weren't relationships. They were revenue streams. I sat in the lawyer's office listening to the reports, almost numb. Irina had thrown away 20 years of marriage not for passion or love, but for a man who saw her as a walking wallet. It was cruel irony, and part of me almost pitied her. Almost. The preparation for court intensified. Sergei agreed to testify. The financial records were organized. My lawyer even tracked down one of the other women Pavel had exploited, who agreed to share her story. The noose was tightening, though Irina still tried to walk around as if she could charm her way out of it. At home, the atmosphere was unbearable. She avoided me, but when our paths crossed, her face twisted with hatred. Once, she screamed that I was destroying her life. I didn't answer. There was no need. She had destroyed it herself. The day before the first court session, another revelation landed. I was going through old paperwork when I noticed discrepancies in property documents. One of the rental apartments we had purchased years ago had been refinanced recently. My name was on the paperwork, but again, the signature wasn't mine. The loan had been taken to cover Irina's hidden debts. That meant the fraud was even deeper than I had thought. When I showed the documents to my lawyer, he nodded gravely. This is no longer just divorce. She's committed crimes. The judge will see it. The weight of 20 years of shared life had shifted entirely. We were no longer husband and wife. We were opponents in a war, one I hadn't chosen, but one I intended to win. The courtroom loomed ahead, and with it, the collapse of Irina's carefully constructed lies. She had gambled everything, marriage, money, reputation, on Pavel, and he had already begun to abandon her. Her allies were thinning, her daughter slipping from her grasp, her financial safety nets collapsing one by one. And yet, as I prepared for the trial, I couldn't shake the thought that she might still have one more card hidden. People like Irina rarely accept defeat without dragging someone else down with them. The question wasn't whether she would fall. The question was how much destruction she would cause as she did. The courthouse was nothing extraordinary, but the weight of what would happen inside it pressed on my chest like iron. 20 years of marriage, reduced to documents, witnesses, and the eyes of strangers waiting to decide who was telling the truth. Irina entered with her lawyer at her side, dressed in a way that screamed careful preparation, subdued colors, modest jewelry, her face painted with practiced sorrow. I knew the act well. She had used the same mask countless times when she wanted sympathy from friends or favors from family. But masks crack under pressure. The judge began with the financial evidence. My lawyer presented the records, forged signatures, fraudulent loans, unexplained transfers. Each page felt like a hammer landing on the table. Irina's lawyer tried to object, insisting the documents were misinterpreted, but handwriting experts confirmed what I already knew. The signatures weren't mine. They were hers, disguised as mine. Then came the testimony. Sergei, steady and unapologetic, described what he had seen. Irina with Pavel outside restaurants, hotels, always close, never hiding enough. He spoke calmly, like a man who had no interest in drama, only truth. Yulia followed, her voice trembling at first but growing stronger. She told the court about her mother's attempts to manipulate her, about overheard conversations laced with money problems and secrecy. Watching my daughter choose truth over loyalty to her mother was painful, but it was also the clearest proof that Irina's influence had finally shattered. The most devastating testimony, however, came from the other woman Pavel had exploited. She described how he had charmed her, drained her money, and left her when she could no longer give. Her story mirrored Irina's, exposing Pavel as a predator who used women for profit. By the time she finished, even Irina's lawyer looked uneasy. When Pavel himself was called, his confidence had evaporated. He avoided Irina's eyes, answering questions with clipped phrases. Under oath, he admitted to receiving money from her, though he tried to frame it as gifts. But the records showed otherwise, transfers labeled as training fees, loans funneled into his account. His contradictions piled up until even the judge raised an eyebrow. Irina's mask cracked then. She lashed out, accusing Pavel of betrayal, screaming that he had promised her everything. The judge's gavel silenced her, but the damage was done. In that outburst, she revealed not only the affair but also her desperation, her inability to control the narrative anymore. By the end of the session, the verdict was clear. The divorce was granted in my favor. The house remained mine, the assets protected, the fraudulent debts tied to her alone. The judge ordered further investigation into her forged loans, leaving the door open for criminal charges. Pavel, exposed and humiliated, faced his own ruin as the gym terminated his contract and his reputation collapsed overnight. Irina sat there as the judgment was read, her face pale, her hands trembling. She had walked into the courtroom hoping to play the victim. She left it stripped of every shield she thought she had. The consequences unraveled quickly. Creditors began calling her directly, demanding payments for loans she could no longer hide behind my name. Friends she had once entertained turned away, unwilling to associate with scandal. Even her own family, who had believed her sob stories, grew distant when the truth became undeniable. For me, the aftermath wasn't triumph but relief. The weight of years of deception lifted, leaving behind a strange emptiness. Freedom can feel heavy when it follows so much betrayal. But as I stood outside the courthouse with Yulia by my side, I knew I had made the right choice. The revenge hadn't been loud or theatrical. It had been precise, measured, and devastating. She had taken 20 years of marriage and gambled it on a man who never cared for her. In the end, she lost everything: her comfort, her reputation, her stability. Pavel disappeared soon after, leaving the city when his name became a byword for manipulation. Last I heard, he was trying to start fresh somewhere else, though whispers of lawsuits followed him. Irina remained behind, living in a small rented flat, her former life nothing but ashes. As for me, I rebuilt. Slowly, carefully, with Yulia's support and the knowledge that I had survived not only betrayal, but also the attempt to ruin me financially. The house became quieter, lonelier at first, but then peaceful. Silence without deceit is easier to live with than conversation poisoned by lies. Sometimes I catch myself thinking back to that night in the parking lot, when I first saw them together. If I had confronted her then, shouted or fought, perhaps she would have twisted the story, painted me as jealous or cruel. By staying silent, by planning carefully, I had taken control. The greatest revenge had not been the freezing of accounts or the courtroom victory. It was watching her realize that every step she had taken to destroy me had only destroyed herself. That was karma, delivered in full. And that's the story. If you're still here, that means you're one of us. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button. I drop new chaos every single day, and trust me, tomorrow's story, it's even worse than this one.